On a scorching June morning in 1876, along the winding banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory, the most catastrophic military defeat in American frontier history was about to unfold. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, the golden-haired boy general of the Civil War, rode at the head of his legendary 7th Cavalry, confident that glory and victory awaited him in the valley below. What he found instead was annihilation so complete, so shocking, that it would echo through the corridors of American memory for generations. This is the story of how 200 Sioux warriors, fighting alongside their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies, delivered a crushing blow that shattered the myth of American military invincibility and wrote one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the American West. The seeds of this disaster were sown not on the battlefield, but in the glittering depths of the Black Hills, where gold had been discovered the year before. The sacred lands of the Lakota Sioux, protected by solemn treaties signed with the United States government, suddenly became the target of thousands of prospectors hungry for fortune. What followed was betrayal on a scale that would ignite the Great Sioux War of 1876 and set the stage for the most decisive Native American victory ever achieved against United States forces. To understand the magnitude of what transpired at Little Bighorn, we must first journey back to the winter of 1875, when the United States government issued an ultimatum that would change everything. All Native Americans were ordered to return to designated reservations by January 31, 1876, or face the consequences as hostile combatants. This decree, impossible to communicate across the vast wilderness and rejected outright by the proud warriors of the plains, made confrontation inevitable. The stage was set for a collision between two worlds, two ways of life, and two concepts of honor that could never be reconciled through words alone. In the sprawling camps along the Little Bighorn River, which the Lakota called the Greasy Grass, something unprecedented was taking shape. By late spring of 1876, more than 10,000 Native Americans had gathered in defiance of the government's ultimatum. This was no ordinary war party, but the largest gathering of Plains Indians in recorded history. Sitting Bull, the revered medicine man and spiritual leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, had united multiple tribes under a single banner of resistance. His village stretched over 2 miles from end to end, consisting of nearly 1,000 teepees arranged in 6 horseshoe-shaped semicircles that housed 8,000 men, women, and children. What made this gathering truly formidable was not just its size, but its composition. These were not the reservation Indians that army officers had grown accustomed to dealing with. These were free warriors, hardened by years of conflict, armed with the latest weaponry, and united by a common purpose that transcended tribal boundaries. Among them rode Crazy Horse, the legendary Oglala war leader, whose tactical brilliance had already earned him a fearsome reputation among military commanders. Together, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse commanded a force that would soon demonstrate the deadly combination of superior numbers, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and an unshakable determination to defend their way of life. The intelligence reports that reached General Alfred Terry and his subordinate commanders painted a vastly different picture. Army estimates suggested that Sitting Bull commanded perhaps 800 fighting men, a force that the experienced 7th Cavalry could handle with relative ease. This catastrophic miscalculation would prove to be one of the most deadly intelligence failures in American military history. In reality, nearly 2,000 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors stood ready to defend their families and their freedom, many of them equipped with repeating rifles that gave them a significant advantage over the single-shot carbines carried by Custer's troopers. The weapon disparity was more significant than anyone in the army realized. Archaeological evidence later revealed that approximately 200 Winchester Model 1866 repeating rifles were in the hands of the Native American fighters, along with various other firearms ranging from modern weapons to older muskets. About half of the warriors carried guns, while the other half wielded the traditional short bows designed for mounted combat, deadly at close range and capable of loosing arrows faster than any soldier could reload his carbine. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer embodied the aggressive confidence of the American Frontier Army. Flamboyant, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own tactical genius, He had built his reputation during the Civil War as a daring cavalry commander who struck hard and fast against Confederate forces. His golden curls and flashy uniforms had made him a media darling, and his victories against scattered bands of Plains Indians had only reinforced his belief in the superiority of disciplined cavalry charges against Native American forces. But the enemy waiting for him at Little Bighorn was unlike anything he had faced before. As Custer's column of 600 men entered the Little Bighorn Valley on June 25th, the fatal flaw in his tactical thinking became apparent. Dividing his forces into multiple columns, as was standard cavalry doctrine, Custer sent Major Marcus Reno to attack the southern end of the village while Captain Frederick Benteen scouted to the southwest. Custer himself led 5 companies, approximately 210 men, toward what he believed would be a flanking position against a fleeing enemy. Instead, he was riding directly into the most sophisticated trap ever laid by Plains Indian warriors. The older Sitting Bull, though not primarily a war chief, rallied the defenders and ensured the safety of the women and children, while Crazy Horse gathered his warriors for a coordinated counterattack. What followed challenged every assumption about Native American fighting tactics, rather than the individual acts of bravery that characterized many Plains Indian battles. This engagement demonstrated remarkable tactical coordination and discipline. Archaeological investigations conducted decades later would reveal the systematic nature of the Native American assault, tracking individual warriors as they moved across the battlefield in coordinated formations that gradually tightened around Custer's isolated command. The battle began with Reno's attack on the southern end of the village, but the Major's force was quickly overwhelmed and forced into a desperate retreat across the Little Bighorn River. As Reno's men scrambled for defensive positions on the bluffs, Crazy Horse was already implementing a masterful flanking maneuver that would seal Custer's fate. Leading as many as 1,000 warriors, Crazy Horse swept around the northern end of the battlefield, cutting off any hope of retreat and surrounding Custer's command in a tightening noose of rifle fire and arrows. The archaeological evidence tells a story far different from the romanticized accounts that emerged in the aftermath. Rather than a heroic last stand, the battle revealed a pattern of tactical collapse as Custer's formations disintegrated under the coordinated assault. The disciplined cavalry advance dissolved into panic as warriors emerged from every direction, their superior firepower and intimate knowledge of the terrain giving them an overwhelming advantage over the confused and outnumbered soldiers. As the sun climbed higher over the Montana plains on that fateful June morning, the sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, mixing with the war cries of charging warriors and the desperate shouts of cavalry officers trying to maintain some semblance of order among their rapidly dwindling ranks. Under the blazing Montana sun, the disciplined formations that had made the 7th Cavalry famous began to crumble like sandcastles before a rising tide. Custer's men, trained for conventional warfare against Confederate cavalry, found themselves facing an enemy that moved like shadows across the rolling hills, appearing and disappearing with deadly precision. The warriors struck from gullies and ravines that the troopers had never seen, their knowledge of every fold and depression in the landscape turning the battlefield into a maze of death. The first casualties fell within minutes of contact. Troopers who had expected to catch a fleeing village instead found themselves surrounded by enemies who fought with a ferocity born of desperation and righteous anger. These were not the scattered bands that army patrols had grown accustomed to pursuing. These were fathers defending their children, husbands protecting their wives, and warriors fighting for the survival of their entire way of life. Captain Miles Keogh's 1 company held the right flank of Custer's advance, their horses stamping nervously as the sound of battle grew closer. The experienced Irish officer had served in campaigns across the frontier, but nothing had prepared him for the coordinated assault that was about to engulf his men. From the coulees to the north came the thunder of hooves as Crazy Horse's mounted warriors swept down like a prairie storm, their war paint gleaming in the afternoon sun, their rifles and bows ready for the killing work ahead. Lieutenant James Calhoun's L Company, positioned on the southern edge of the formation, suddenly found themselves facing a wall of warriors emerging from the broken ground along the river. The young officer, Custer's brother-in-law, shouted orders to his sergeants, but his words were lost in the crescendo of battle cries and gunfire that erupted from every direction. His men began falling before they could properly deploy their weapons, the rapid fire of Winchester repeating rifles cutting through their ranks like a scythe through wheat. The tactical genius of the Native American assault became clear as warriors who had fought together for years executed maneuvers with the precision of a military drill. Small groups of mounted fighters would charge forward, drawing the soldiers' fire, then wheel away as fresh warriors emerged from concealed positions to strike at the exposed flanks. This was warfare refined through generations of buffalo hunts and intertribal conflicts, adapted now to the deadly business of destroying an enemy that had come to annihilate their people. Sergeant Frederick Williams of E Company watched in horror as his fellow troopers began to break ranks, some men throwing down their single-shot carbines and drawing their Colt revolvers in desperate close-quarters fighting. The non-commissioned officers, the backbone of any cavalry unit, found themselves trying to maintain order among men who had never faced an enemy quite like this. The warriors seemed to anticipate every move, cutting off retreat routes and forcing the soldiers into an ever-tightening circle of death. Captain Tom Custer, the general's younger brother and a Medal of Honor recipient, led his C Company in a desperate attempt to break through the encircling warriors and reach higher ground. But for every yard gained, the cost grew heavier. Horses screamed and fell, their riders tumbling to the ground where they were quickly overwhelmed by warriors wielding war clubs and knives. The romantic notions of cavalry charges and glorious death in battle evaporated in the brutal reality of hand-to-hand combat on the windswept hills. Archaeological evidence later revealed the systematic nature of the Native American victory. Individual weapons could be tracked across the battlefield as warriors moved from position to position, their advance measured in the fallen bodies of Custer's command. What had begun as a coordinated military formation dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance, each group of soldiers fighting desperately as the circle of warriors closed around them like a noose. The sound of battle carried across the valley to where Major Reno's battered command clung to their defensive positions on the bluffs. Through field glasses, the survivors could see dust clouds and muzzle flashes marking the location of Custer's fight, but they were powerless to intervene. Their own position remained precarious, surrounded by warriors who kept up a steady fire that prevented any attempt at relief. Captain Frederick Benteen's column, returning from their fruitless scout to the southwest, arrived to find Reno's men pinned down and desperate, with no sign of their commanding officer except the distant sound of gunfire that grew steadily weaker as the afternoon wore on. Sitting Bull moved among the warriors with the calm authority of a man who had foreseen this moment in his visions. The great medicine man had dreamed of soldiers falling into their camp like grasshoppers from the sky, and now that prophecy was being fulfilled with terrible precision, he ensured that the women and children remained safe in the lower end of the village, while directing the flow of ammunition and fresh warriors to the points where they were needed most. The individual acts of heroism on both sides became lost in the larger tragedy unfolding on the battlefield. Young warriors earned their adult names in the fierce fighting, while veteran soldiers who had survived the Civil War and years of frontier service met their end far from home on the lonely hills above the Little Bighorn River. The clash represented more than a military engagement. It was the collision of two civilizations, each fighting for what they believed was their right to exist. As the shadows began to lengthen across the valley, the intensity of the fighting reached its climax. Custer's remaining men, perhaps fewer than 40 still able to fight, had been driven to a small ridge where they made their final stand. The general himself, his buckskin jacket now torn and stained with dust and blood, continued to shout orders and encouragement to his men even as the situation became hopeless. His famous luck, which had carried him through countless battles, had finally run out on this remote hillside in Montana territory. The warriors pressed closer, their victory now assured but their determination undiminished. Every fallen soldier represented not just a military triumph, but revenge for years of broken treaties, murdered families, and the desecration of sacred lands. The battle had become a reckoning, a moment when the accumulated grievances of generations would be settled in blood and gunpowder smoke. The final moments of Custer's last stand unfolded with the relentless inevitability of a gathering storm. On the wind-swept ridge that would forever bear his name, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer found himself surrounded by the remnants of his once proud command. The golden-haired general who had charged into battle with such supreme confidence now faced the bitter reality of tactical annihilation. Around him lay the bodies of his brothers Tom and Boston, his nephew Orty Reed, and his brother-in-law James Calhoun, their dreams of frontier glory extinguished in the Montana dust. The warriors closed in with methodical precision, their movements coordinated by war chiefs who had turned the art of plains warfare into a deadly science. From every gully and depression came the flash of rifle barrels and the whistle of arrows, each shot finding its mark among the desperate soldiers huddled on the hilltop. The troopers' ammunition was running low, their single-shot carbines no match for the rapid fire of Winchester repeating rifles that poured death into their thinning ranks. Sergeant Miles O'Hara of F Company, a veteran of Gettysburg and a dozen frontier skirmishes, pressed his back against the fallen body of his horse and continued firing until his last cartridge was spent. Around him, younger soldiers who had enlisted seeking adventure on the frontier now faced the grim reality that their bones would bleach on this desolate ridge far from home. The romantic notions of cavalry heroics died hard among men trained to believe in the superiority of American arms and discipline. Crazy Horse himself led the final charge, his war pony's hooves pounding across the buffalo grass as he closed the distance to the surviving soldiers. The legendary war chief had orchestrated this victory with tactical brilliance that would have impressed the finest military minds at West Point. His flanking maneuvers had isolated Custer's command from any hope of relief, while his coordinated attacks had systematically destroyed the cavalry's ability to fight as a cohesive unit. The last shots echoed across the valley as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, where 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry had ridden into battle with flags flying and bugles sounding. Now, only silence remained. 210 men lay dead on the rolling hills above the Little Bighorn River, their bodies scattered across nearly a mile of battlefield in testimony to the completeness of their defeat. The archaeological evidence later revealed the final desperate moments of individual soldiers. Cartridge cases clustered around defensive positions told the story of men who fought to the last bullet, while the distribution of bodies showed how the formations had collapsed under the overwhelming assault. Some troopers had tried to escape down the coulees leading to the river, only to be cut down by warriors who knew every fold and depression in the landscape. Among the Lakota and Cheyenne, the victory songs began to rise from the great encampment as word of the triumph spread through the Tipis. Women who had feared for their children's lives now celebrated the warriors who had defended them so successfully. Old men who remembered the promises and betrayals of treaty councils nodded with grim satisfaction, knowing that this day would be remembered as long as their people survived. But even in the moment of greatest triumph, the wisest among them understood the terrible price that victory would exact. Sitting Bull, his weathered face grave despite the celebration around him, knew that the white soldiers would return in numbers that would darken the plains like locusts. The death of Long Hair, as they called Custer, would bring a whirlwind of vengeance that would sweep across the northern plains with devastating force. The news of the disaster reached the outside world through the desperate messages sent by the survivors of Reno's command, who had witnessed the destruction of their comrades from their precarious positions on the bluffs. Telegraph wires carried the shocking reports eastward, where Americans celebrating their nation's centennial received word that their most famous Indian fighter had been wiped out along with his entire immediate command. The reaction was swift and terrible. General Philip Sheridan, commanding the Division of the Missouri, immediately began assembling forces for a campaign of retribution that would dwarf anything previously seen on the western frontier. The death of Custer became a rallying cry for those who demanded the complete subjugation of the Plains tribes, regardless of treaty obligations or moral considerations. Within weeks of the battle, additional cavalry regiments were marching toward Montana territory, their ranks swelled by volunteers eager to avenge the fallen hero of the Civil War. The peaceful solution that some had still hoped might be negotiated between the government and the free tribes died with Custer on that hillside, replaced by a grim determination to crush all resistance through overwhelming force. The great encampment began to disperse within days of the victory, its leaders understanding that remaining together would only invite the concentrated wrath of the army. Sitting Bull led his followers toward the Canadian border, while Crazy Horse took his warriors back to the familiar hunting grounds of the Powder River country. The unity that had made their triumph possible began to fracture under the pressure of survival, as each band sought safety in the vast of the Little Bighorn had last wilderness that had always been their refuge. The battle less than 2 hours, but its consequences would echo through the remainder of the Indian Wars and beyond. The tactical lessons learned by both sides in that brief, savage engagement would influence military thinking for generations. For the Native Americans, it represented the pinnacle of their resistance to American expansion, a moment when superior tactics and determination had overcome overwhelming odds. Yet the victory carried within it the seeds of ultimate defeat. The death of Custer galvanized American public opinion in a way that previous conflicts had never achieved, transforming what had been seen as routine frontier police work into a matter of national honor and revenge. The political will to wage total war against the Plains tribes, previously constrained by cost and public indifference, now became an unstoppable force that would pursue the survivors across every mile of the Western Territories. As darkness fell over the battlefield on June 25, 1876, the bodies of Custer's command lay where they had fallen, their uniforms already being stripped by warriors seeking trophies and useful equipment. The horses that had carried them into battle now roamed riderless across the valley, while the ravens gathered for the grim feast that awaited them on the hillsides. The Little Bighorn River continued its ancient course toward the Yellowstone, its waters unchanged by the human drama that had played out along its banks. But the world around it had been transformed forever by 2 hours of violence that would be remembered as long as the American story continued to be told. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scope of the catastrophe that had befallen the United States Army. As dawn broke over the blood-soaked battlefield on June 26th, the surviving members of Major Reno's command gazed out from their defensive positions with horror and disbelief. The hilltop where Custer had made his final stand lay silent, marked only by the dark shapes of fallen men and horses scattered across the grass like broken toys discarded by some vengeful god. Captain Frederick Benteen, the grizzled veteran who had arrived too late to affect the battle's outcome, surveyed the scene through his field glasses with the practiced eye of a soldier who had witnessed the worst that warfare could offer. Even he, hardened by years of frontier service, found himself shaken by the completeness of the destruction. Not a single man from Custer's immediate command had survived to tell the tale of those final desperate moments. The warriors had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, melting away into the vast expanse of the Montana plains like smoke before the wind. Only the evidence of their devastating victory remained, scattered across the rolling hills in a testament to tactical brilliance that no military academy could have taught. The great encampment along the Greasy Grass had begun its dispersal even before the last echoes of gunfire had faded, its leaders understanding that such a concentration of force could not long survive the vengeance that would surely follow. Private Charles Windolph of H Company, one of the few survivors who had witnessed the battle from Reno's position, would later describe the eerie silence that settled over the valley once the fighting ended. The absence of sound seemed more terrible than the cacophony of battle itself, broken only by the occasional cry of a wounded horse or the rustle of wind through the buffalo grass. The very air seemed to hold its breath, as if the earth itself recognized the magnitude of what had transpired on its surface. The news of the disaster traveled eastward with the speed of lightning through telegraph wires that carried the shocking reports to a nation still celebrating its centennial. In Washington, military commanders, who had grown accustomed to reading routine dispatches about successful campaigns against scattered bands of hostiles, found themselves confronting a reality that challenged every assumption about American military superiority. The boy general who had been the darling of newspaper correspondents and the hero of countless dime novels lay dead in a remote valley that most Americans could not even locate on a map. President Ulysses Grant, himself a veteran of countless Civil War battles, received the news with the stoic demeanor of a soldier who understood that warfare always carried the possibility of defeat. Yet even he could not have anticipated the political firestorm that Custer's death would ignite across the nation. The general, who had been criticized in some quarters for his flamboyant behavior and controversial testimony before Congress, suddenly became a martyred hero whose death demanded immediate and overwhelming retribution. The Battle of Little Bighorn stands as more than a military defeat. It was the moment when two civilizations collided with such force that the reverberations changed the course of American history forever. In less than 2 hours on that scorching June afternoon, the myth of inevitable westward expansion met the reality of indigenous resistance, and for one brief, shining moment, the warriors of the plains demonstrated that courage, tactical brilliance, and the will to defend one's homeland could triumph against overwhelming imperial power. The legacy of Custer's last stand would haunt the American conscience for generations, a reminder that victory often carries within it the seeds of its own destruction.